Okay, well, good evening, good morning, and for some, good afternoon. Welcome to the first of a special two-part 21 JPSI Brookings collaborative webinar series examining U.S.-Japan relations under the Biden administration. My name is Adam Liff, and I'm hosting this event from Indiana University, and in my capacity as director of the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative here at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies. For those of you joining us for the first time, our mission here at 21 JPSI is to encourage and support research, teaching, and programming on contemporary Japanese politics, social issues, and international relations, and to serve as a Midwestern hub for the study of contemporary Japan and its domestic and foreign policy challenges. 21 JPSI was established in 2018 with support from a generous seed grant from the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership, which is also supporting our webinar tonight, so thank you to them. Please check out our website to learn more and for more information about upcoming events, all of which will be free and open to the global public, just like this one. Now, I'm especially excited about this event tonight because it marks my first collaboration with my colleague and friend at the Brookings Institution, Mireya Solis, who is director of their Center for East Asia Policy Studies. Thank you again, Mireya, for partnering with us and helping to organize these panels. Before we get started, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, of course, Adam. Thank you very much. At Brookings, we're truly delighted to be collaborating with you and with the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative in putting together this two-part series looking at U.S.-Japan relations under the Biden administration. And we are gathering tonight or this morning, depending on where you are, at a moment of tremendous change. Certainly the United States is confronting some major challenges, but also in international order. And I think it's a testament that we're going to be covering so many topics where the U.S.-Japan partnership can make a difference in addressing those international challenges. So for me, a word of recognition of your program, of gratitude for working together, but also gratitude to our speakers who are going to share their insights on these very important issues. And of course, we're very excited to have all of you in the audience with us. We want to hear from you. Please send your questions, and please also come back next time, next week, same time, when we're going to talk about the trade, economic, and transnational challenges and U.S.-Japan relations. Thank you, Adam.
All right, thank you very much. And I should note that though I have the pleasure of moderating tonight's panel, Mireya will take charge and moderate next week's panel on trade and transnational challenges. So please do look forward to that. All right, so let's turn to tonight's topic, which is national security, alliance management, and domestic politics. Now, the most direct inspiration for this two-part webinar series is, of course, the inauguration next week of the Biden-Harris administration. But beyond the transition, we've asked our speakers to take a little bit of a longer-term view and assess what the foreign policy priorities should be for the US and Japan over the next 3 to 5 years. Now, our focus tonight is on international security, but as the past couple years and certainly the past couple weeks have made extraordinarily clear, domestic political or other unexpected developments can powerfully affect political leaders' ability to actually implement desired foreign policies. And President-elect Biden and his transition team appear to well understand this. They've made a link to domestic politics explicit, already announcing that their administration's goal will be to break down barriers between national security and domestic policy. And meanwhile, providing another link between domestic politics and international security, though US-Asia strategy has historically been fairly bipartisan, recent years made clear that that should not be taken for granted. So tonight, we've asked our panelists to share with us their thoughts about the major challenges and security policy priorities for the allies and how they evaluate the current state of US-Japan cooperation in their area of expertise on the eve of a new administration. Now, to address these important issues, we have an all-star and binational lineup of experts. Full bios are available online. So I'll just briefly introduce our panel in the order we've asked them to speak to you tonight. After they each give just a few minutes of prepared remarks, roughly 7 or so, I'll moderate a discussion among the group before we open things up for questions from our global audience. So you can submit a question for our panel at any time. Please just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Leading us off and to offer his thoughts on US-Japan alliance priorities from the perspective of an expert on China's military, we have Andrew Erickson of the US Naval War College, where he's professor of strategy at the college's China Maritime Studies Institute and also helps manage its research relationship with the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Forces. Andrew has asked me to note up front that the views he shares tonight are his alone and not those of the US government. After Andrew speaks, we'll hear from Yuka Koshino, Research Fellow with the Japan Chair at the Institute of International Strategic Studies in London. Now, recent years have seen a huge increase in emphasis, especially in Japan, on so-called emerging technologies and national security. And tonight, Yuka will share her thoughts on alliance priorities in space, cyberspace, and beyond. Third, we've asked Sheila Smith, Senior Fellow for Japan Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, to share with us her views on various issues related to the Korean Peninsula and alliance management challenges in the years ahead. And last but not least, we'll hear from Toshihiro Nakayama about what implications domestic political developments carry for alliance cooperation going forward. Toshi is a professor of American politics at Keio University and also a fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. So many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, both our panelists and our global audience. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our first speaker. Andrew, can I ask you to get us started, please?
Thank you very much, Adam, for that kind introduction and for this opportunity to speak with everybody on the important topic of the vital and irreplaceable US-Japan alliance. If we could go to my first slide, please. I really want to start things off here with a map, because President-elect Biden and his administration will inherit and confront many shifting things, but one thing that will be relatively constant is the geography of this vital but vulnerable region. And Japan is at the very center of that important and in some ways contested geography. This image is from a PLA Navy textbook, and what it shows quite clearly is the way in which some Chinese strategists look very closely at what they consider to be chains of islands going through this region. This concept is not unique to Chinese strategists, and it is not new. In fact, it is one of the key dynamics of great power competition throughout this region over the past century or more. And the key point to take away from this is just how central Japan is located in this contested geographic area. And to a certain extent as well, Taiwan is related to that and in a vital position. In this particular era of history in which President-elect Biden and his administration will be standing watch and helping to manage the vital US-Japan alliance, it is unfortunately an era in which the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is engaged in a series of aggressive and assertive and in some ways expansionary policies in this vital but vulnerable region that is haunted by history. Specifically, the People's Republic of China is pursuing a set of policies very assertively and sometimes aggressively seeking to advance interests and control in disputed island and maritime claims. If we go to the next slide, please, this shows some of those disputes. And the most vital are, again, connected with this conceptual first island chain and also connected with Japan's archipelagic situation of more than 6,000 islands and its vital strategic interests. And Taiwan, of course, is related to this as well. If we go to the next slide and final slide, we can see the way in which China is pursuing these disputed claims. One of the ways it is pursuing these claims is to use three different sea forces, each the world's largest by number of ships, concentrated in this contested region. this is in some ways a different kind of contestation from decades past in the island chains, in that China is willing in some cases to draw out the competition over years. It is not seeking to actually go to war over these claims, but it is using a variety of techniques that are seeking to coercively envelop key areas of this region, and thereby to carve it out as a zone of exceptionalism in which important international laws, rules, norms, and institutions do not apply. I believe strongly that we must work closely with our Japanese allies to make sure that this is not simply allowed to erode the vital foundations of peace and prosperity that roughly 8 decades of blood and treasure have purchased at such terrible cost. Moving forward, it will be vital for President-elect Biden and his team to work very closely with Japanese counterparts to further develop and enhance this unique alliance and set of partnerships. And I would be happy to discuss further how I think that best can be done. But I wanted to share my personal views to start out with a note on just how high I think the stakes are and how important an area of focus this will be for President-elect Biden and his team, as well as their very important Japanese allied counterparts and other allies and partners throughout this important region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam and Mireya, for inviting me to speak today. And it is my great honor to speak with distinguished group of experts in the US, Japan, and Asia policy community. So for my opening remarks, I would discuss 3 security challenges in the emerging domains in space and cyberspace, and what it means for the US-Japan alliance under the incoming Biden administration. So the first challenge I would like to raise is China's increasing investment and use of asymmetrical capabilities in space and cyber domain to challenge the deterrence created by the US-Japan alliance. In space, China has been aware that about the fact that US and Japanese military operation heavily relies on space-based military communications or positioning and navigation satellites and so on. It has successfully developed anti-kinetic and non-kinetic anti-satellite weapon systems to disrupt or halt US and Japanese military operations. So China is already, in this field of cyber, China is already also investing in offensive cyber capabilities, and not just to penetrate the military and government networks, but increasingly important is its access and use of cyber weapons in commercial networks, which is very important in the era where technology has become the critical theater for US-China strategic competition. There was a recent example in 2020, for instance, that a Japanese defense company was hacked, and there was access to the specifications for Japan's hypersonic weapon systems. So the second challenge I would like to raise is the rapid growth of Chinese digital footprint in the region under the Digital Silk Road projects, which is a project where Chinese companies and government projects to spread Chinese 5G or e-commerce platforms or smart city projects as part of the digital dimension of the Belt and Road Initiative. So cyberspace is dual use by nature. So the security, reliability, and the trust of this digital infrastructure, such as network system or data centers, clouds, or facial recognition technologies critical for smart cities, are crucial for security and regional prosperity. Trust in 5G is especially important because it is expected to serve as the backbone of the digital economy in the next decades to come. And it will connect, 5G will allow to connect not just the smartphone, but also IoT devices, cars and factories, with transformative industrial applications and economic impacts. And the Indo-Pacific region, which is becoming the world's most rapidly expanding digital population and economy. So it is strategically an important place for US and Japan. And that is also a theater where China is especially investing and expanding its digital footprint. The fundamental problem and issues for the spread of Chinese firms' technology is really the risk and its alleged ties between the firms and the Chinese governments to conduct security activities. And the challenge for the alliance that we face now is that while we do understand about the security risks behind these technologies, there hasn't been, the countries have been struggling to offer attractive alternative solutions to these Chinese high-tech and cheap solutions. The third challenge is the lack of governance in these emerging domains. So in space and cyber, as well as the development and use and applications for emerging technologies such as AI, quantum technologies, and biotechnologies, is really the challenge that the alliance faces as well. There is, for instance, no arms control deals in space or cyber, or agreed norms on how we use digital technologies and how we use these domains. And on digital governance, for instance, even like-minded partners like US, Japan, and European countries have yet reached an agreement on how the data should flow freely, or what kind of privacy and security regulations should be considered in the data governance regimes. And the lack of coordinating response among US, Japan, and like-minded partners creates space for China to lead and assert its digital governance model in these new domains. So that is why these are the priority agendas for the incoming administration and the US-Japan alliance in the next several years or even decades to come. And so the current state of US-Japan cooperation, so how effectively is the alliance responding to these challenges, and what does it mean for the Biden administration? So to deal with the military challenges in space and cyber, the past 5 years has been we've seen steady progress in enhancing bilateral cooperation under the guidelines of US-Japan defense cooperation, especially in space. We have seen examples of establishments of greater cooperation between the Japanese Air Self-Defense Forces New Space Defense Squadron and its US counterparts to boost the space situational awareness, and also greater capacity for information sharing between these two parties. We have also seen progress to enhance resiliency of the space-based assets in case of an attack, such as an agreement to host US sensors on Japanese payloads, which is considered as the most advanced form of alliance cooperation in space in the world. In cyber, there has been statements made at the 2+2 meetings in 2019 that state-sponsored cyber attacks in certain conditions could be considered as to defend under the Article 5 of the US-Japan Treaty. On challenges to meet the spread of unreliable digital infrastructure by Chinese companies like Huawei, we have also seen some progress under the digital connectivity pillar of the shared free and open Indo-Pacific vision between the two countries, such as development of financing mechanisms for digital infrastructure projects in third countries, or emerging discussions to develop and promote a multi-vendor open RAN 5G networks, or new technologies like the virtualized RAN networks that allow to become alternative, cost-effective solutions to Chinese networks. These are important steps because one of the criticism towards Trump's administration's anti-Huawei campaign or anti-Chinese technology campaign was that they're creating pressure, they're pressuring other allies and partners to ban these technologies without providing attractive and alternative solutions. Yet there are several major issues that the alliance needs to tackle to meet the challenges in the new domain. One is the need for policy coordination and alignment on how to deal with the rise of Chinese influence in digital space and Chinese increasing capabilities in these new technologies. For instance, there was a conflict between the US and Japanese approaches. The US approach under the Trump administration was more a unilateral and exclusive approach under, for instance, the Clean Network Initiative to ban and regulate Chinese technologies, while Japan has been pushing for a vision for an inclusive and open and rules-based approach to govern this this area, like the proposals for the data free flow with trust. Other challenges include the need for policy coordinations with like-minded partners to maintain the technological edge in critical and emerging technologies, like AI and semiconductors and quantum technologies, as I mentioned earlier. This could include building a resilient supply chain or information sharing and coordination and R&D programs to avoid redundancies. There are high expectations on the Biden administration to take a more coordinated approach with allies and partners and taking leadership role to meet the global governance gaps that I've mentioned. And there's also an expectations to eventually return the US administration to return to major trade agreements, which has become increasingly important in the context of security to deal with the multidimensional challenges from China in the new domains. I will end my opening comments here. Thank you.
So I think it's my turn. I'm Sheila Smith from the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm delighted to be here. And there's so many things we can talk about. My assignment today is to talk to you a little bit about the Korean Peninsula and the security challenges to the US-Japan alliance. I'm going to focus my remarks largely on North Korea, but hopefully in the Q&A we can talk a little bit more about the Japan-South Korea relationship. So I think it's important, and again, for those of you who don't follow these issues very, very closely, it's important to remember that the US military presence in Northeast Asia is a signal of the American intent to extend the nuclear umbrella over its two allies, Japan, obviously, and also South Korea. And so US troops in South Korea total about 28,000 men and women in uniform, and in Japan we have about 50,000 US military forces forward deployed, including a significant naval capability in the region. But I think, you know, the longstanding, whereas Andrew and Yuka were talking to you a little bit about the new dimensions of security challenges posed to the alliance, the Korean Peninsula is a longstanding security challenge for the United States and Japan. It is in many ways, it stems from the Korean War in 1950s. It is one of the reasons that the United States and Japan concluded a security treaty way back at the beginning of the post-war era when it concluded the peace treaty in San Francisco in 1951. So Korea and the division of the Korean Peninsula is a long-standing security challenge for US and Japanese forces in the region. What's new about this challenge for the alliance today, of course, is Pyongyang's determination to develop a nuclear capability, not only to reach its neighbors, but also to reach across the Pacific Ocean to the United States. And so there's a two-pronged effort here. One is to develop a nuclear weapons and deploy them on missiles that would deliver that nuclear capability across the region and obviously to us here. So Pyongyang's nuclear and missile program poses significant new challenges for the alliance. These challenges there are three of them I'd like to share with you today. The first is clearly the DPRK, and particularly in 2017, if you were watching the region, the DPRK demonstrated the sophistication and the progress it's made in its missile arsenal, largely by allowing its missiles not to be fueled by solid fuel, but by liquid fuel. And in other words, it now has mobile missiles that would be capable of launching warheads from undisclosed locations. So there's an element of surprise that comes with that. The second is just the sheer number of missiles now in the North Korean arsenal, both short, intermediate range missiles that would overwhelm any kind of ballistic missile defenses that are currently deployed in the region. So it's not just that North Korea has new missiles that it can launch, it has more sophisticated technologies applied to that missile arsenal that really put Japanese defenses under the spotlight. So in 2017, you saw a lot of the launches were not necessarily aimed at the United States, but they were aimed at countries within the region, obviously South Korea and Japan. And the Japanese felt incredibly vulnerable to this new set of technologies. What this means for the alliance, of course, is that the United States and Japan need to make sure that their extended deterrent posture is capable to this new challenge. And so you have a pretty deep conversation ongoing since 2017 between the United States and Japanese governments on this. The second piece of the puzzle, and this is specific to Japanese defenses, and for those of you who've been following the debate in Japan, you'll recognize that there's a new aspect of Japanese, a new conversation in Japan over whether or not the time has come for Japan not to solely rely on ballistic missile defenses, but also perhaps to invest in acquiring retaliatory capability. And that retaliatory capability, of course, is one of the core pieces of deterrence. The idea here is by developing a conventional strike capability that might be able to reach out and touch North Korea, it would make the North Koreans think twice about launching any kind of missile strikes on Japan. So it's not only the alliance's extended deterrent posture that's at question here, it's also Japan's own thinking about what it needs to adequately defend and deter itself against North Korea's increasing capabilities. And then finally, the US and Japan, we are both trying to figure out how best to persuade North Korea, not only the two countries, the US and Japan, but also South Korea and other countries who are represented in the United Nations, trying to convince North Korea that its interests might be better served by abandoning its nuclear program. And I think often Tokyo and Washington have found themselves slightly out of sync in the negotiation efforts that try to figure out how to reduce threat from North Korea, both by making North Koreans feel more secure, but also by obviously trying to deter Pyongyang from its nuclear ambition. I think today, this is one of the pieces of the puzzle that may not be at the top of the Biden administration's to-do list, but it will certainly be one of the pieces of the puzzle that the Biden administration will have to think about. And I think in Japan, there's a real concern here that after the Trump administration, and of course, President Trump met with Kim Jong-un twice, once in Singapore, once in Hanoi, the Japanese government feels very, very strongly that it is not a time to acknowledge the nuclear capability of North Korea, but rather to continue to put pressure, maximum pressure, on North Korea to abandon this goal. The United States, you find a variety of opinions on this issue. I think there are some who feel like we can't really, that horse has left the barn, so to speak, and that maybe a moratorium on missile and nuclear testing might be the better negotiating aim. But I sense that even as we go forward, Tokyo and Washington will have to get themselves lined up a little bit better on how to proceed should we find ourselves in a moment of negotiation yet again with Pyongyang. So let me talk a little bit about the Biden administration as they come in. Right now, North Korea, like many countries around the world, is deeply focused on the pandemic. But we are still looking at a technological progress in North Korea that will sooner or later confront us and our allies' security in the region. So the Biden administration, I think, will have to think carefully about how its alliances operate and how it wants to pursue this relationship with North Korea or its relationship with others around the region to try to contain North Korea, the threat that's emanating from North Korea. Typically, we end up getting into these conversations about negotiation after there's been some provocation from the North. And I think it's important right now that there's lots of, as we transition here in the United States in terms of our presidential leadership, there's often a moment where North Korea tends to take the advantage of that moment to get the attention of the incoming administration. I'm not sure we are in the same kind of moment here, given the pandemic and also given obviously what's happening in the United States. But I do think that one of the first things that is going to be very important for the incoming Biden administration is to make sure that our allies feel that their security is fully attended to by Washington. And I think you'll find some reassurance being given to both Seoul and Tokyo on the extent of the efficacy of the extended deterrent, but also in thinking concretely about what a nuclear North Korea might mean for the alliance and upgrading our ability to deter more actively any kind of future provocation. I think there's also going to be a policy review, and this is obviously between Japan and the United States will be a very important conversation for the incoming Biden administration to have. And that is, where do we stand today in the wake of 4 years of President Trump? Where do we stand on this question of negotiation? Is there an opportunity to be had? And if so, how do we line up more effectively with our allies in the region? One complicating factor, of course, is the Japan-South Korean relationship today has deteriorated considerably over issues of war legacy. And so I think there's going to be some remedial attention to be paid to whether or not Japan, Tokyo and Seoul might find themselves in a more cooperative relationship on the security challenges posed by North Korea. But I do think Japan has been very, very active along with Seoul, but with other partners in Asia and in Europe even, on monitoring the sanctions that have been imposed by the United Nations to try to contain financial flows as well as technology flows to the north. And again, Japan has played a very important role in leading that effort, that international collaborative effort. So again, I expect the Biden administration will want to also talk to the international coalition partners in the implementation of UN sanctions. Finally, let me conclude with one thought here, and that is we are not in any other moment, as you may well have guessed. The pandemic has created terrible suffering, and there's evidence coming from humanitarian agencies and others that North Korea has suffered tremendously. There may be a moment for us to regroup, and by us, I mean the United States, Japan, and South Korea, in thinking about whether or not we may have an opportunity here, not to go back to the old playbook, but to engage Pyongyang in a different way, given the pandemic, given our ability to offer humanitarian and scientific assistance to the North Koreans. So I think we ought to always keep the door open to a creative diplomatic approach, and not always fall back on the patterns that we've seen in the past. And I think this is an opportunity for both the Suga cabinet and the Biden administration to think more clearly about whether or not there's a creative opportunity for negotiation for threat reduction in the region, specifically focused on North Korea. Let me end here for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for having me here. I'm Toshihiro Nakayama from Keio University and JIIA, Japan Institute of International Affairs. The task I was given is to explore domestic political challenges in both countries affecting US-Japan cooperation. And a lot is going on in both countries, but especially on your side, I guess. So the premise of my remarks is that foreign policy does not exist in a vacuum, but it is closely related with what's going on domestically. And with COVID-19 on both sides and political turmoil, especially on your side, we cannot ignore these factors. There's been a leadership change in both countries. And after a long and stable leadership in Japan, we now have a Suga administration. The preceding administration, Abe administration, was I would say the most stable administration that we had in a long time. Of course, he was extremely lucky because he was facing a weak opposition party, and there was no challenges to him from within the Democratic Party. Most of all, he liked sort of dealing with foreign policy, and he was focused on sort of dramatically improving the image of Japan's foreign policy. But it's not that he only liked it. I think he realized the need to sort of improve, Japan's foreign policy, facing new realities in the region. I think for him, managing a U.S.-Japan relations or managing its relations with the U.S. was not an easy task. During the Obama era, the rebalance, which is the policy of focusing on Asia, despite that message, I think President Obama was perceived as being a retrenching president. Of course, the policy of rebalance was a very sophisticated policy, and it listed all the things that U.S. had to do in this region. But precisely because of that, because there were many elements to it, it was a weak message, and it wasn't all that sure what America wanted to do. Right? Then we faced Mr. Trump, and his message of America first. And we were always in doubt whether he really understood the importance of the alliance. So for us, President Obama may have been a sophisticated retrencher, and Mr. Trump being a blunt retrencher, but two seem to be retrenchers nonetheless. Right? So it was, I think, a difficult period or a difficult task for Prime Minister Abe to manage its relations with the U.S. But when they understood 4 years ago that we have to be dealing with the Trump administration, I think he embraced Mr. Trump without any hesitation. And I think it would have been difficult in other sort of Western democracies to do this, because among the public in other Western democracies, this doubts about Mr. Trump was extremely strong. And many saw Mr. Trump as a sort of an existential threat to, this institution of democracy. But here in Japan, existential threat was more in form of China. So people basically supported Mr. Abe's embrace of Mr. Trump. And especially Mr. Trump's attitude towards Trump, it's the punch you in the face toughness toward China, and the fact that he labeled China as a revisionist power. And precisely because of that, there was a sort of understanding that for Japan, Mr. Trump might be better. So although it was a difficult task, I think, and putting this personal chemistry aside, I think Prime Minister Abe dealt with this, managing U.S.-Japan relations pretty successfully. So how about under a Suga administration? I don't think it's realistic to expect, this, Abe-Trump chemistry, because that was exceptional. But I think he would basically follow what Prime Minister Abe did. And his foreign policy was based on the fact that U.S.-Japan relations and alliance is critically important. And I hear that they're trying to arrange this bilateral a meeting with President Biden as soon as possible. And Japan just named a new ambassador to the United States. But even though that is our intent, I think Prime Minister Suga would be preoccupied with dealing with a domestic issue, mainly COVID-19. So it will be a domestic focus. But there is sort of an impasse in that front, because in terms of the policy dealing with COVID-19, the messaging part is not as clear, and we're not sure what the administration is trying to do. So the approval rate has dropped to 41%. That's a pretty tough number. And, as I said at the outset, Prime Minister was intent on sort of rebranding the image of Japan's foreign policy. And the world would be looking at Prime Minister Suga and sort of consider whether this new foreign policy, new sort of forward-leaning foreign policy was specifically a Abe thing, or Japan has sort of structurally changed. So Prime Minister Suga is facing that kind of question. What about the United States? There was this editorial carried by Yomiuri Shimbun titled, "Violence in Capital Shows U.S. Not Worthy of Role as a World Leader of Democracy." Right? It's a shocking title, a shocking editorial, but understandable. Right? And I think this shows that the worries sort of extend beyond the Trump administration. It is that American sort of domestic political institutions has become fragile, and it is undermining the foundation for the U.S. to conduct a sort of robust sort of internationalism-based foreign policy. And it is not something that these things will be sort of reinvigorated, reset with the the Biden administration coming in. And I think Biden team would have to focus on domestic policy as well. And he would have to sort of reset the interventionism that started out in 2001. And we hear that Biden team will seek foreign policy agenda that meets the needs of the middle class at home, which is totally understandable if you think about the domestic sort of political context. But it is not a strong message. It won't be a strong message in terms of America sort of reviving its a robust internationalism. We all hope this worry is to prove unfounded. But the big question is, what would Japan do? Maybe in a short term, this response is an overreaction. But if you think about the fact that the strategic competition with China would extend beyond 2050, and if you think about the mid to long term implications, whether sort of forward-leaning posture of the U.S. would be maintained beyond the mid-century, maybe our sort of worries are not sort of overblown. I think important thing for now, precisely at this moment, and literally today, tomorrow, and up to January 20th, is things would stay calm. Nothing would happen so that it would undermine the institution of democracy and sort of hurt the image of the Biden administration and sort of the foundations of robust American internationalism. So I will end here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Toshi, and thank you, everyone. I don't think I've ever seen 4 panelists cover more topical ground in half an hour than the 4 of you just did. So thank you. You've really given us a lot to think about. It's certainly clear that the US and Japan face a number of very complicated issues in the national security space. And the conversation about how the allies can most effectively approach these challenges, either independently or in concert with other partners, will be ongoing. So your opening remarks have really helped us appreciate what the right questions should be going forward. So I have a couple of additional questions for the 4 of you, but before I turn to that, I'd just like to remind our audience that now would be the perfect time to submit your questions. You can use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Please do try to be as concise as possible and clearly identify to which panelist you're addressing the question. Okay, so thank you again for the very informative and thought-provoking opening remarks. My first question for the panel is for everyone, but Sheila and Yuka, I was wondering if perhaps you could start us off. So based on where we are today at the end of the Trump administration, what do you think should be the new administration's top priority as it concerns Japan or more generally Asia policy in, say, its first 100 days or so? Would you say that the alliance is in pretty good shape? And what would you advise the new Biden team to focus on right out of the gate? Sheila, could you start us off?
Sure. So the Biden campaign advocated very clearly that it wanted to restore America's alliances. And so they're coming back into office in with a foreign policy agenda that really emphasizes our alliances and how to work collaboratively with our partners in Asia and Europe specifically. And so I think it's a moment of opportunity for the US and Japan to talk more specifically about what actually that means. And I think as Toshi Nakayama pointed out, in Tokyo, you don't have the sense that the alliance was crucially damaged by the Trump administration. And that may be surprising to some of our listeners who see the NATO alliance, for example, as being targeted by the president. So I think you've got different gradients of estimation about what needs to be restored and how. And I think what's going to be really important for the Biden administration, and again, Andrew brought this up in his comments, and Yuka emphasized it in hers, but the region didn't stand still while we had our Trump administration, right? The region has moved on, and China has moved on, and we're still waiting to see what post-pandemic North Korea looks like. But there's been a lot going on in the region that we need to catch up on in some ways. And so restoration is great, and I don't disavow that ambition, but I think it needs to be a kind of channeling a little bit and listening a little bit to how our allies, especially Japan, sees the agenda for the next 5 or 10 years going forward, not just today and tomorrow. And they're not going to really buy into this idea that the alliance was weakened by Trump. And I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge for our policymakers in the region. So part of what I'm saying, Adam, is its style and approach, and they need to catch up a little bit, I think, on what's been happening in the region.
Yeah, I mean, a tremendous amount has happened in the region over the last 4 years. And this is another point that will come up next week when we talk about certainly international trade, free trade agreements, RCEP, CPTPP, and others, but also in the national security space as well. The region's not simply just waiting for the United States. But I especially appreciate your point that in Japan, the impression of Trump administration policy toward East Asia may not be really generally as similar as it is to a lot of the thinking in the United States. But Yuka, what are your thoughts? Oh, Sheila, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Just one example that I think might be illustrative of that is the Biden administration is going to have a clear answer on how they feel, for example, about Japan acquiring conventional strike. I mean, that's a military issue, but it's an issue that's been debated in Japan. It's been debated in the 4 years of the Trump administration. I'm not sure I know yet what the Biden folks coming in are going to think about that. But that's just one example of how the table is kind of set. They're going to need an answer to that question, right, as they go forward.
Yeah, and that issue has actually already been raised in the Q&A. So I will be coming back to you on that point later on during audience question. But Yuka, what are your thoughts on what the Biden administration should really prioritize right out of the gate?
Yes, I think I very much share the views that Sheila just mentioned, and I don't know how much I could actually add to that. But I guess I would also emphasize the fact that despite during the campaign, we have been hearing a lot about how the Biden administration would want to approach China. But in order to get China right, I think it's very important to really be clear about how it is going to work with allies, and also what's more important, how the Biden administration would approach with regional countries. So yes, there was a shared vision under Trump and Prime Minister Abe and Suga to cooperate in the Indo-Pacific region. But what the reality is that the senior officials in Trump administration have, for instance, skipped the ASEAN-led regional, very important political and economic meetings like the East Asia Summit, and ASEAN focused on multilateral institutions. And really, if the Biden administration, I think Japan is very interested in hearing how much and how willing the Biden administration is to committing to the region and how much it wants to continue the ongoing U.S. cooperation that has been going on under the Trump administration to promote the free and open Indo-Pacific vision.
Okay, thank you, Yuka. For my next question, I'd like to turn to Toshi and Andrew. So as you know, and Toshi, you and I have talked about this in the past, a tremendous amount of the public and media discourse tends to focus on the executive branches and the individual of the president or the prime minister in particular. But history really teaches us that, for example, in the US case, the US Congress has an important role to play in shaping US foreign policy, including towards Asia. In my mind, the kind of powerful case in point is the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act. So I'd like to ask the two of you, when you think about the major security challenges the US and Japan are likely to face in the years ahead, what do you see as the appropriate role of the US Congress in either supporting or perhaps advocating for a more effective US-Asia strategy? And are there any particular priorities you would point to? Andrew, do you want to start us off?
Yes, thank you, Adam. That's an incredibly important point. And of course, Congress is vital for a variety of reasons, including having the power of the purse. And there is going to need to be very significant and concrete investment in a variety of targeted initiatives to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open and secure. It would be a devastating mistake to let that erode, because so many things that Americans and their allied counterparts count on would be put in jeopardy by that. So I think in Washington and within Congress, there's going to be an increasingly robust and important discussion about policy towards the region, and in particular, how to face challenges, including a variety of threats from the People's Republic of China under Xi Jinping. And I think it will be vital for President-elect Biden and his administration to work effectively with that larger context. There's going to be a larger discussion. There are going to be a lot of more specific discussions, but governing effectively in the US and managing effectively policy vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific will require a very effective management by the incoming administration of relations with Congress. Unfortunately, from the president-elect on down, there is some very specific experience, expertise, and understanding in that area. So I think it's going to be where all key stakeholders are going to have to make a sincere and concerted effort. But I think over time, this can be done and the results will be good. So I think in a nutshell, President-elect Biden can and will draw very heavily on his nearly 4 decades experience in Congress to play a vital role in connecting all this. It's going to be a very important conversation and process.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Toshi.
Hi. Okay. I guess the fact that many of the tough policy on China seems to be rooted in Congress is a welcome. It's not just an executive thing. Mr. Trump and his team was tough on China, but many actual policies were rooted in the legislative branch. So that's good. The recent sort of the Senate election in Georgia made Democrats the majority in the Senate. And that sort of worries us a bit because there will definitely be a pressure on sort of defending spend cuts. So that's a bit of a worry as well. And of course, the legislative branch is extremely important. But having said this, the message from the executive is what we hear. And here in Japan, especially regarding China, what we seek is not a sophisticated policy, but we prefer a message, a clear message. So we're worried about sort of, we welcome the sort of the sophisticated thinking behind, Biden's China policy, but we worry a bit that it's going to be sort of muddled and the message not clear. So yes, the legislative branch is definitely important, but the message from executive is, I would say, much more important than that.
Great, thank you both very much. And recent developments just in the past few months, Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or certainly as it concerns US engagement of Taiwan. I think Congress, there's a lot of activity there, a lot of discussion, and it'll be interesting to note how that dynamic plays out with the incoming administration. So thank you for sharing your views. Okay, so we're almost ready for audience questions, but before I open things up to the wider audience, I'd like to end with a lightning round of sorts and just challenge each of our panelists to, if you could, in just a sentence or two, share with our audience what you think beyond the issues you already talked about in your opening remarks, in your area of expertise. What do you think is going to be the single greatest foreign policy challenge for the US and Japan over the next 3 to 5 years? And you don't have to limit it necessarily to national security issues, but I'm just curious what you think, and then we'll open things up for the audience. Sheila, would you like to start us off?
Sure, that's kind of easy. It's Taiwan. I think for the United States and Japan, both for different reasons, we are really unprepared for a serious Chinese set of pressures, both military, economic, and political pressures on Taiwan. And I think what we've been seeing over the course of this year, both in the precedent set with Hong Kong, and I'd love to hear Andrew's thoughts about this, but increasingly the way in which the PLA has been acting in and around Taiwan, and again, I'll stay in my realm of the security challenges, we are unprepared for what ifs in Taiwan, and we can talk at length about why we're unprepared. But I think even the United States is unprepared for the question of what will we do? What would we actually do if there was a serious challenge to the autonomy of Taiwan? But I would put Taiwan at the top of the list, absolutely.
Thank you. Yuka.
Yes, I guess it's very difficult to actually choose one great challenge, but I will say as a category, unpredictable events are really a high risk for the alliance. This could include, I mean, one example is Taiwan, any kind of contingencies in Taiwan or any regime instabilities in North Korea or China itself could also become unpredictability. But I also like to strengthen the fact that I currently live in London as well. It's the fact that pandemic, we haven't discussed a lot yet, but there's still a lot of unpredictability about how the pandemic, how the countries could overcome or could not overcome the pandemic, as we have seen the current rapid expansion of the COVID-19 variant, which could limit the resources and also shift the attention of diplomatic policies to more of a domestic discussions, and the ability for the United States to manage this domestic health crisis is really critical to think about how the Biden administration could do more in Asia or engage more with regional allies and partners, as I mentioned in my previous comments.
Great, thank you, Yuka. Andrew.
I agree with the other panelists that keeping Taiwan free, democratic, and part of an open Indo-Pacific is likely to be the most important challenge. In support of that, I think the incoming administration needs to fully embrace the fact that there is no more important alliance, US alliance, than that with Japan. And in managing that alliance, there are going to be important times when we need to lead from the front, so to speak, and accept some friction and sometimes give Japan some space. There'll be no substitute for that. Another related way to support is to appoint an ambassador who is ready from day one to deal with very high level, the highest level security and crisis management issues. And frankly, the ambassador should befit the alliance, should convey instant credibility in Tokyo, clearly have the president's ear, and show top level US respect for that important alliance. There should not be a number of media speculations about what other considerations were made and, you know, how was this balanced against other people XYZ. No, bottom line, the mention of the ambassadorial appointment is going to be a key litmus test for how the incoming administration is regarding this alliance. I trust and I pray that that test will be passed because, as others have indicated, we are entering a truly vital era.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Toshi.
Well, I agree with all what's been said, but I would say American leadership, right? Because it's going to be the foundation of everything. And, you know, Task Force Japan is trying to fill the vacuum if the leadership is not there. We've done this during the Trump administration. We hope we can sort of, you know, execute the leadership together. But I think American leadership is the biggest challenge and the worry. And in terms of this ambassadorship, I think someone like Cindy McCain would be perfect, right? Bipartisanship, strong, sort of a symbol of strong, robust American internationalism, and a woman, a female ambassador, right? So that would be the right balance. So I'm sort of, you know, tweeting on Twitter that maybe someone like her would be a perfect ambassador to Japan.
Okay.
Half joking, but half serious.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Now it's time to open things up to our audience for the remainder of our time. And we've got over, by my count, over 30 questions already coming in. So please do keep them coming, but sincere apologies to anybody if we're not able to get to your question. We won't be able to get to them all. And also in the interest of clarity and brevity, we may edit or combine some questions as we sort through them, but we'll try to capture their basic spirit. So the first question I think I'd like to ask, it's come in various forms from several audience members, and I know it's something on the minds of a lot of folks in Washington and Tokyo these days. It also relates to one of the points that Andrew just made about the importance of personnel. And I'd like to direct it to Toshi and Yuka to start if I could. So one audience member writes that in a recent Foreign Affairs article, President-elect Biden wrote that China presented, quote, a special challenge, Yet, as we all know, there have been some concerns expressed within and outside the US about some past statements on China, and an impression shared by some that neither of Biden's picks for Secretary of State or Defense have extensive experience with or a clear record of prioritizing Asia. Now, that's not to say that in their positions they would not. It's just it's been an issue of some discussion in recent months. And so on the other hand, though, during the campaign, the transition and the transitions rhetoric, they've really presented a sense that they view China as a serious competitor and security challenge, and have also repeatedly emphasized cooperation with allies as front and center in Biden administration's foreign policy. So I'd like to ask, based on your own personal views or your sense of the discourse in Japan these days, do you share these concerns? What, if anything, in terms of personnel or policy, do you think the US could do if they wanted to reassure those who are concerned about these recent names that have come up? And looking forward possibly to an ambassadorial appointment or lower level appointments that are really going to be crucial for formulating US policy toward the region at state, the NSC, and elsewhere. Yuka, would you like to go first? Or Toshi, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm not going to elaborate my views, but I'll try to elaborate views in Japan. I think the perception is that the incoming Biden foreign policy have said all the right things about China, but there are doubts because of the first Obama team's sort of G2 sort of China policy, and that made a very strong impression on Japan. So although the perception of China has changed in the mid-2010s, and Democrats are generally much more tougher on China than when the Obama administration took off, this image of sort of G2 policy toward China is making a very strong impression on Japan. So that is at the sort of the roots of our worries. And also, if you look at the foreign policy team, Mr. Blinken, Mr. Kerry, and most of the people, and Biden himself, they seem to be more of an Atlanticist. So they see the globe not in the sort of the westbound, but the eastbound, right? There's the Atlantic, there's Europe, Middle East, and there's Asia, on the Far East. They tend to see the globe in that way. So I know that intellectually they do understand that China is a threat and China is a serious competitor, but they have not been raised in that environment. They are Atlanticists. So we're a bit worried of the tendency that they have within themselves. They may have said all the right things, but that's the source of our worries.
Yuka?
I think Professor Nakayama really covered very well on how the Japanese public or the policy community or experts community have viewed the recent kind of who was appointed and who are leading the foreign policy team in the Biden administration through the transition. So these points about whether Japan is actually, whether the United States is actually going to follow through what the Biden administration has said in the campaign, and also this kind of potential tendency towards more focus on coordination with European allies rather than coordinating closely with Japan has been a concern, and I think it still remains to be a concern and important to raise these concerns. But I also do think that this is my personal view, but that there's not full information yet on who is actually going to lead the Asia policies in the Biden administration. So I think it's also very important that we don't emphasize or become over concerned about who are the top officials, who are the Secretary of State. But I think it's really important to see who are going to be the key person for the Asia policy. And I think we don't have much information there yet to assess.
Absolutely, that's a very important point. Thank you, Yuka. Okay, Sheila, I promised you we would come back to this issue of kind of strike capabilities, and I'd like to frame it, kind of combine multiple questions that we've received. So it's it's about not just strike capabilities, but also the linked and related issue of recent developments concerning Aegis Ashore and missile defense. And so for our audience, just to let everybody know, last summer, Japan canceled the planned deployment of a land-based Aegis Ashore missile defense system that it was to purchase from the United States. And among other consequences, this decision appeared to really accelerate just the latest round of a multi-year and ongoing debate in Japan about whether or not it should acquire strike capabilities. So Sheila, I guess the question for you is, what is your sense about how things stand now? How much clarity do we have about the future of Japan's missile defense posture? And to put an alliance spin on it that you touched on it a minute ago, if a policy shift were to lead to a major adjustment, say in the traditional sword spear bifurcation of alliance priorities, how confident are you that the allies are well situated to address the associated alliance coordination and management challenges that would come out of that?
Great. So you want me to do that in 1 minute, right? No, there's a lot embedded in there. So let me just say a couple of things. So the idea of offensive strike, of course, is coming out of, as you know, Adam and others know well, the idea that the self-defense forces are now 24/7 in operational readiness mode. And there is two pieces to this puzzle. One is Japanese investment, what they call standoff capability, which is to push any kind of intrusion off of the territorial land of Japan into the air and space away from Japan. So there's an indigenous investment in that capability, and there's going to be increased capabilities associated with that. That doesn't mean that Japanese self-defense forces will have the capability to reach deeply into China or to reach a military base in North Korea that's critical. And that's where the offensive strike question comes up. And there's a general sitting inside the Beltway in Washington among the people who watch the alliance and are close up on the alliance, both the Pentagon and diplomatic. You're increasingly coming to a fairly identifiable consensus that perhaps the time has come for Japan to have that kind of retaliatory capability. Now, the question for the alliance, however, is how does that what kind of capability is it, and how does it fit into the way the alliance conceives of, as you pointed out, the sword and the shield? The Americans will have strike, Japan will be defensive. I think we're just reaching the threshold where that is really clearly no longer a good operational concept for both militaries, that there has to be much more integration of capabilities, and that means then that there has to be a political discussion on the use of force in the alliance. Who gets to use it? When does it happen? How are contingencies organized? And these, of course, are conversations that the US and South Korea have had, the US and our NATO partners during the Cold War had, but we've never really had to have, as you know well, in the US-Japan alliance. This has not really been conceived of as a war-fighting alliance. And so it's not just what capabilities can we take off the shelf that give Japan retaliatory capability. It's not that simple. I think it's going to be, my personal view is it needs to be a much more in-depth strategic review of the alliance to say, okay, how do we share roles, missions, and capabilities, which is the Pentagon lingo, but really how politically do we approach this question of integrated war fighting in the off chance that we're going to have to fight a war together. And again, this is new territory for Japan. And I think it's going to take political leadership in both capitals, but it's not just going to be, oh, let's buy a couple of missiles. It's not going to be solved by a capability, an investment in capability. It's going to need to be solved in a real strategic review of what kind of scenarios the alliance might be engaged in real military operations together.
Thank you, Sheila. And I'm sorry I misspoke earlier. I should have said shield and spear.
No, it's okay.
Sword and spear is a very different alliance dynamic. I'm not sure what that might look like, but apologies for that, and apologies to our audience. So Sheila, you've raised a very important question about strategic review, and one of the things being discussed today in Tokyo is, does the national security strategy, which dates back to 2013 in the Abe administration, need to be reviewed? I think there's an emerging consensus that yes, and that should be taken care of in the near future. One issue that I expect, given the developments of the past 8 years now, that will figure prominently in that discussion, both within Japan by itself, but also in consultations with the United States, is the so-called gray zone challenge and the various manifestations of that these days. And so, Andrew, if I could turn to you now, could you share with us, I know this has been a major focus of your research in recent years, could you possibly share with us a little bit more about your sense of the nature of that challenge these days, especially as it concerns perhaps the East and South China Seas? And given that, what would you advise the US and Japan to focus on in their discussions as part of that strategic review?
Well, thank you, Adam, for underscoring that vital issue. I put up the slide earlier on China's 3 sea forces because this is really central to understanding how China operates in the region. Through a synergistic combination of forces, it's seeking to advance its disputed sovereignty claims and erode vital rules and norms in what might broadly be called peacetime, without ever having to go to high-end kinetic conflict that I believe our very strong and very widely supported US-Japan alliance deters successfully against. So I don't think that China or North Korea, on the worst days of aggressive leadership impulses, can successfully come down in over the top of the US-Japan alliance, so to speak. But the problem is China has worked very hard to devise a strategy and a force structure that risks allowing it to come in from underneath the bottom at very low levels of intensity that can be hard for our respective forces to respond to effectively. Now, we do have many response options, and awareness and coordination is really the first step. And Adam and others have contributed to this book by the China Maritime Studies Institute, the Naval Institute Press, and a number of our Japanese colleagues on China's maritime gray zone operations. And it's wonderful that some of those colleagues have helped to coordinate and lead a translation into Japanese. And this is not just a compilation of analysis on China's Coast Guard and maritime militia and the gray zone operations they engage in, but it really represents a great allied informational collaboration. Moving forward, we need to continue to broaden and deepen that information gathering and analysis. But I believe it's vital for both countries, the US and Japan, to make broader and more robust public statements to make further clear just the awareness we have of China's maritime gray zone operations, or resolve to not be fooled by this. We are not fooled. We are not going to let China use various types of military directed state actors to resolve sovereignty disputes by state-sponsored means and act as if just because they're not using conventional Navy forces, it's somehow stabilizing or okay. So I'm very heartened that there's already a strong foundation here, but we need to clearly build on that further and find even more effective ways to express our resolve and explain to our publics, as well as to the Chinese public, the exact nature of this. So a good start, much more work to be done. It is a somewhat complicated area, but the key points are clear and known, and we can and we should, I think, respond effectively. And so that's something I'm personally going to be recommending to the Biden administration in my capacity as an individual academic.
All right, Andrew, thank you very much. We are just about at the end of our time, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask just one more domestic politics related question as it concerns specifically a question's come in about the future of the Suga administration and Prime Minister Suga. And so, he announced last September, of course, that he would more or less inherit Abe's platform on foreign policy, though his priorities differ somewhat as it concerns, carbon zero and other aspects. Yet after starting out, Toshi, as you mentioned, after starting out very, very popular, amidst the pandemic and other challenges, public support for the current cabinet has really plummeted the past couple months, which for some, especially in America, raises concerns about a possible return to this relatively frequent leadership turnover in Japan. And frankly, the US, I think a lot of folks in the US had gotten used to having Prime Minister Abe and his team, including Suga as chief cabinet secretary, really a source of political stability within Japan over the past 7 years, 8 months. So looking out 3 to 5 years, can I just end with everybody's quick reaction or thoughts about what the prospects are for major political change in Japan's politics that could affect US-Japan cooperation going forward, especially on security issues? And then I'll wrap it up and we'll say goodnight. Toshi, could you start us off?
Well, yes, his approval rate is dropping because of his handling of the COVID-19 situation. But the thing is, there's no serious a challenge to him at the moment, and the sort of the credibility of the opposition party is like minimal. So in that respect, maybe we would have a weak but a stable sort of leadership. I don't know whether that's good or not, but maybe, for some years, maybe that's the kind of leadership that we would be having.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to comment on this? Sheila?
Just a couple of comments, and it refers a little bit to some of the earlier conversation we were having about defense budgets and investment and things like that. So we're all in the middle of this COVID pandemic, and I think it goes without saying that the resources we're going to have to bring to bear to many of the alliance issues that we've all talked about, they're going to be somewhat constrained, and that's constraint in Tokyo as much as it's constraint here in the United States. And I think that's not a LDP versus Democratic Party in the US. I don't think it's a partisan issue so much as it's a realistic. We're going to take a couple of years, I think, until we really fully comprehend the economic impact of the pandemic. The second is on, if you look historically at US-Japan, alliance transformation, strategic reviews, all the kinds of big picture things that we've all been talking about tend to come when there's a prime minister in Japan that stays in power for a certain amount of time. And you need a certain amount of traction and leadership, political leadership on both sides of the Pacific for us to be able to accomplish these things. And so our uniformed and civilian personnel in the Pentagon and the State Department can do so much, but if you really want this kind of overhaul of the strategy for the alliance, we're going to need some pretty strong political leadership on both sides.
Thank you. Yuka, Andrew, any comments on this final point?
I'll just add that from the perspective of technologies and areas in new domains, I would also emphasize the importance of continuation. So dealing with China, I think there was a Brookings report calling that this is a superpower marathon by Michael Brown, by director of the DIU in DOD. And there's need to be a longer term strategy against China to compete technologically, and that'll include more robust discussions about how to incorporate our allies, and to begin with, to identify and share information on what are the critical emerging technologies to protect, and on what kind of projects, R&D projects should be pursued, and how to pool these R&D investments, and to also cooperate with allies and partners to map out the technologies and find the strength areas among the allies and partners. And that requires a long-term strategies and planning. And so that will be a concern. So short-term kind of an approach to these issues will be definitely an issue and concern for the US-Japan alliance going ahead.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, any last words?
I believe that the alliance is sufficiently strong so that it transcends individuals and budgetary numbers. It's not a mystery, some of the key things that we need to do, and they can be done. So I think with the right resolve, we will indeed preserve the peace and prosperity and the freedom and openness of the vital region through the alliance. And I look forward to working in an individual capacity to support that.
Okay, all right, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everybody. I'm afraid we're at the end of our time, folks. Thank you for sticking around a few minutes past the previously scheduled end time. But on behalf of Mireia Solis and myself, I'd like to thank our panel for a wonderful dialogue and our audience members for their great questions. As I noted at the outset, we will be back again exactly 1 week from today on the eve of the inauguration for the second of our two-part webinar series, which will focus on trade and transnational challenges. So I hope you can join us for that. We'll promote the details through Twitter and other means. And with that, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we hope to see you back here soon. And good night, everybody. And thanks again to our wonderful panelists and for staff support. Good night.